The first step in creating an animated sequence is to set up the time configuration. And that's found in this button in the lower right hand corner here, right next to the time controls. You'll see time configuration. It looks like a little dialog box with a clock on it. Click on time configuration, and you can choose your frame rate. It's defaulted to 30 frames per second, or NTSC, and that's the acronym for the old school analog television in the United States. If you choose PAL, that's 25 frames per second, but ironically, this doesn't change here. So it still says 30, but when you choose PAL, you're actually working in 25 frames per second. If you choose film, it's going to be 24 frames per second. Or if you choose custom, then you can type it in directly here. So this is just a bit odd that this number doesn't change, but just keep in mind NTSC is 30, PAL, the European television standard, is 25, and film is the US film standard, which is 24 frames per second. I'm actually going to leave it at NTSC 30 frames per second. Over here, we can choose to display frames. We can also display time in SMPTE timecode format if we want. So that's going to show us seconds and frames. I'm actually, once again, just going to leave it at frames. And then finally, we can set the length of our current timeline. This isn't permanent. We can always come back in here and change this. For now, I'm going to set my timeline to be 5 seconds long. And if we're running at 30 frames per second, 30 times 5 is 150. So I'll set the end time here to 150 frames. And if I press the Tab key, these all update. And this tells us that the length is 150 frames, and the frame count is 151 because frame 0 is counted. All right, so there we go. Click OK. And now we've got 150 frames in our timeline, and we're running at the default 30 frames per second. Before we can animate, we need to set up a hierarchy for the sword object because it's actually 3 different objects. I want to make the hilt the parent so that I can just select that hilt and move and rotate all the other pieces with it. If I select that hilt, you'll see that its pivot point is here at the pommel. I just want to move that over, go into the hierarchy panel, grab the effect pivot only, and then the move tool. And let's do this in the top view so we're really sure what we're doing. Just going to move that over so that the pivot point is centered more on the grip. And that'll make the entire object and all of its children rotate around that point. And then link the other 2 pieces. In fact, we can link them both at once. I can select the blade and control select the guard and then choose select and link. Click on either one of those 2 and drag over to the hilt and release. And now that parent-child relationship has been made, you can grab the move tool, select the hilt, and the other part should move with it. Let's try rotating, and you'll see the other parts rotate as well. Excellent, so undo that. Before we animate, we want to set up the key filters down here. There are 2 methods of animation in 3ds Max. There's set key mode and auto key mode. We're going to look at set key mode first. And the first step of that is to choose which channels or which properties of the selected object are going to be animated. We'll go into the Key Filters dialog here. Click on Key Filters, and you'll see checkboxes next to all the things that are going to be animated when we press the big skeleton key button here. We don't want to be animating IK parameters. That's inverse kinematics. It doesn't apply to this situation. We also don't want to be keyframing the scale. And in fact, to begin with, I'm just going to animate only the position. So I'm going to turn everything off except for position. And now we've set those set key filters. And when we create keyframes, only position keys will be created. With our key filters configured, we're ready to start creating animation. I want to animate the sword flying into the frame and landing. And I want to start it from just outside the frame so that we don't have a lot of wasted time before anything happens in the animation. And I'm going to just do something here with the camera. Select it and go into the Modify panel and enable Show Cone. What that does is it makes it so that the frustum is always visible even if the camera is not selected. If I deselect it, we can still see that cone. That's helpful so we can know whether an object is in the frame or not, or what its relationship to the frame line is. And to make that frustum larger, or that cone larger, I can just move the camera target back a bit. So just select that target only and then move it back. And additionally, I want to adjust it so that, I get roughly the same framing as before. And I think I also want to dolly the camera back a little bit so that we have some margin around our objects. Okay, so if we want to, we can lock down the camera and its target too. That's kind of optional, but that'll make sure we never lose this framing. I'm going to select the camera and control select the target, go over to the hierarchy panel and go to link info and actually just lock all the move channels. And that way I can't actually change the framing. Cool, now we're ready to create our animation. We want to animate the hilt and the other two objects will follow. So I'll select the hilt. And I know that I want it to end in roughly this position at the end of the timeline. So I'll create a keyframe at the end of the timeline first because it's already in that position. Go down to frame 150 and enable set key mode. Once you're in that mode, then you will see a big red highlight here indicating that you're in animation mode. And the active viewport will also highlight in red. And to create a keyframe, just click on the big skeleton key button. And you'll see we have now a marker here indicating that there's a keyframe on the selected object at frame 150. Now I'll create the keyframe for the beginning, go back to frame 0, and use the move tool, and we'll just move that out of frame, and maybe move it down a bit as well. You can do that in the perspective view. We just want to make it so that the hilt is not visible in the camera view. So if I move that over, you can see, okay, it's within that frustum, meaning that we can see it. It's, inside the frame line. We want it to be a little bit out. Okay, and with the hilt still selected, on frame 0, still in set key mode, we can click the set keys button again. And when we scrub our timeline now, we have some motion. And we can also press the play button. By default, we'll only see updating animation in the active viewport. If we want, we can see animation in all viewports. And this is a very lightweight scene, so there's no reason not to do that. It's not going to bog down our system to update all the views. So I'm going to exit out of set key mode for a moment, go back into time configuration, and turn off active viewport only. And if that's off, then we will see the animation update in all the camera views simultaneously. Click OK, press rewind, and press play, and now we can see the object slide into view. And it's taking 5 seconds to do that because we have 150 frames at 30 frames per second. There are many ways to adjust the timing of animation in 3ds Max, and the simplest is to just use the timeline itself. I'll select the hilt of the sword, and you'll see that we have 5 seconds of time here, 150 frames, in which the sword moves from point A to point B. If we want to speed that up, the simplest way is to simply move these keyframes. I can click on this keyframe here at frame 150, and it's highlighted in white now, and I can just drag it down and move it to, let's say, frame 120, and now that'll just be 4 seconds. Make it even clearer, I'll move it, let's say, down to frame 30, which will only be 1 second. Rewind and play that back, and you can see it's moving way faster now. Or if I wanted the entire action to take place later, I could move both of these keys. I could drag a rectangle to select them both, and then click and drag to move them, so that for the first 60 frames of animation, nothing happens. So rewind, play the timeline, and the movement doesn't start until frame 60. Alright, so what I want here actually is I want there to be 4 seconds of animation. I'll take this one back down to frame 0, and I'll put this one on frame 120, and that'll be 4 seconds of animation. .3ds Max has a very useful tool which allows us to visualize the path of an animated moving object. This is called trajectories, and any object that has position keys on it can have its path visualized in this manner. To see the trajectories, you can select the animated object, in this case the hilt, and go to the Move tool, and then in the Command panel choose the Motion panel, and click on the Trajectories subpanel. And now you can see a red line indicate the position of that object at any point in time. And let's change the timeline. Let's scrub down a little bit to more of the middle here. So we can see that there are boxes on either end of the trajectory. Those are the keyframes. And we can select them and move them and change the animation. Go into sub-object mode, and then we can click and select a keyframe or keyframes, and then move it to change the animation. Now we really want to be parked on that point in time as we do this, so we know what we're going to get. In this case, that's frame 120. I want to go down to frame 120 and park my timeline right on that. That way I know what I'm going to get when I move this keyframe around. Let's move it down a little bit. I'll right-click in the front view and just position that down a bit. And then back in the top view, I'll move it over, move it back a bit as well. Okay, so that's a very cool feature. Additionally, we can see the speed of motion using the trajectories. If we zoom in here, we can see that we have little dots on the red line. And the spacing of the dots indicates the speed of motion. Get in a little bit closer. And we can see here that in the middle of the animation, the dots are far apart, but at either end, they're very close together. Each one of those dots indicates a frame. So if the dots are far apart, that means the object is moving a greater distance over the period of one frame, or 1/30th of a second in this case. If the dots are close together, that means that the object is moving a lesser distance in the same amount of time, i.e. it's moving more slowly. All right, very cool. Now, the trajectories are also helpful sometimes even if you're not directly editing them, so that you can kind of track the positions of objects even when you're not directly editing the keyframes in this sub-object mode. So you can turn trajectories on for any object permanently. You'll need to exit out of sub-object mode, and in fact, you'll need to exit out of the trajectories panel itself. Maybe go back to the Create panel. And with that object selected, right-click and choose Object Properties, and enable Trajectory, and click OK. And now that's on permanently until the next time you go into that Object Properties dialog. We can't actually select these keyframes or edit them, so we're not in any keyframe sub-object mode here, but we can at least see the path of the object and its relative speed by keeping that trajectory visible at all times. By default, when you create keyframes in 3ds Max, you will get a classic slow out, slow in, or ease out, ease in animation. And this is when an object picks up speed from a resting position and then slows down as it approaches another resting position. And that's what we're seeing here. Maximize that view with Alt-W. Once again, the spacing of the dots indicates the speed of motion. The object is moving more slowly at the beginning and ends of the animation, and it's moving more quickly in the center here. So that's a slow out, slow in. So it's kind of easing into that final resting position there. In this particular case, we want to adjust that because we don't actually want it to ease out or slow out of its starting position. We want it to be moving at a constant rate of speed as it comes into the frame. We can adjust that using a window called the Curve Editor. So let's select the hilt of the sword and open up the Curve Editor. Here's the button, Curve Editor. Click on that. And this is the function curve editor, and all 3D programs have them. And it should highlight the animated channels for you, or the animated data should already be displayed. If it's not, then you can select these channels over here, or tracks as they're known in 3ds Max, or you can control select multiple tracks. And the function curve editor is displaying the change in the animation data over time. Time is running from left to right horizontally, just like the timeline here. And in fact, we can drag this bar here in the curve editor in order to scrub through our animation. And then vertically is the value. We've got the X position, the Y position, and the Z position color-coded. And you'll see this throughout 3ds Max. X is red, Y is green, and Z is blue. And we see these S curves here. The slope of the function curve indicates the rate of change for that particular value. If the slope is really shallow or flat, that means that there's not much change over that period of time. But if it's really steep, that means that there's a greater amount of change. And that's how we can visualize that slow out, slow in here. We're picking up speed as we go through the middle of the animation and then slowing down once again. What we want in this case is, at least on the outgoing key on frame 0 here, to have linear interpolation. We don't want to have that slow out, slow in. So that we can see this more clearly, I'm actually just going to change all of the keyframes to linear. I'm going to drag a big selection rectangle around all those keys. And we have these various tangent types here. The tangents are these little boxes here at the end of the keyframes that allow us to edit the shape of the curve. And if I click on this straight line, that's set tangents to linear. And let's actually get in really close here so we can see this happen. Okay, so we have a slow out here, and with all those keys selected, I'll click on Set Tangents to Linear. And as soon as I do that now, these lines are all straight, and the spacing of all the dots on the trajectory is equidistant. In other words, the object is moving at a constant velocity. It's not speeding up or slowing down. And let's just minimize the curve editor for a second and rewind and play this back. Take a look, see how that looks different. So there's no slow out and no slow in. And when it reaches that final resting position at the end, it just sort of stops suddenly. And that's not really terribly realistic. We do want it to slow in or ease into that final keyframe. But the behavior at the beginning of the animation is exactly what we want. We want it to have linear interpolation or have no change in the rate of motion at the beginning of the animation. Cool, so I'll stop that. I'll reopen the curve editor, which I've got minimized, and just select the 3 keyframes here at the end of the animation at frame 120, and set those back to the default behavior, which is auto tangents. That's this one here, the very first one. And when you create new keyframes, they'll be set to auto tangent by default. Click on that button, and now we're seeing a slow in there. We can minimize the curve editor once again and play this back. And we see that come to a nice, gentle slow in. We can adjust the timing of the slow in, slow out. Let's go back into the curve editor. I've got that minimized. And we can zoom in to see this more clearly. The controls for navigation in the curve editor are the same as for the viewports, just middle mouse to position. And to zoom in, we can use Control, Alt, and middle mouse. And with this tool, actually, we can zoom horizontally and vertically separately. So if I drag left to right, I can zoom in horizontally. And if I middle mouse drag up and down, I can zoom in vertically. So once again, that's Control, Alt, middle mouse to zoom. Okay, so what we want to do to create a faster slow in, to have it have more of a linear speed and then come to a stop a bit more suddenly, is to shorten the length of these tangent handles. Now I can't actually move them all at once. I have to do them one at a time. But at least I can see them all displayed at once. Just want to make sure I've got those keyframes selected. And I've got the Move Keys tool active by default. And I want to just move that tangent handle to the right. I don't want to move it up and down. Because if we didn't have a perfectly flat tangent handle here, we might have a situation where the curve actually dips down below the minimum value of that key. That's called overshooting. And what would happen is the object would go too far and then come back. Okay, so to prevent that problem from happening, we want to make sure that this tangent handle is perfectly level. And with the Move Keys tool selected, hold down the Control key and then click on one of those handles and drag to the right. And we can shorten that handle. And we need to set all 3 of them to be the same length. And that's important because if they're at different lengths, then the object will no longer move in a straight line. It'll start moving in curves. All 3 of those have to be set to be the same length. Otherwise, we're going to have issues. All I've done here now is change the timing. I have not actually changed the trajectory at all. Let's see what that looks like. I'll minimize, rewind, and play it back. What I expect to see is it still comes to a slow in, but it's not as extreme. And that's exactly what I wanted. I got it right on the first time. But then again, I've been doing this for a long time, so hopefully I know what I'm doing by now. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. There's obviously a lot more to the function curve editor. And there's all kinds of tools in here. You can, retime things and so on. For now, it's good enough for you to know that you can move keyframes around and you can change their position in time. You can shorten or lengthen those tangent handles. So let's say, for example, I wanted to shorten my animation even further. Let's make it only 3 seconds long. Okay, well, with those 3 keyframes selected, currently up here I can see the frame at which those are currently placed. And if I just select one of them, I can also see its current value. But if I select all 3, I can just move them, once again holding down Control, and I can drag those over and drop those at frame 100 or whatever, and you can see the value here. Or indeed, I can just type in the value. If I know that the animation is only going to be 3 seconds, that's 90 frames, with those 3 keyframes selected, I can just type in a value of 90 here and press Enter. And now it's 3 seconds of animation. I'll minimize that curve editor, play this back. Very cool. And you can see here again that the keyframe is positioned on frame 90 in the timeline. That's just a very brief introduction to the curve editor. 3ds Max provides another method for creating animation, and that is auto key mode. And when you're in auto key mode, almost anything that you do in the program is going to create keyframes. So it's one of those modes that you really need to be careful with, because if you're not paying attention, you can accidentally start creating animation on things you didn't mean to. A really common error that people make, and that I've made myself many times, is leave the auto key button on and start working on materials and actually animate the materials accidentally. So if you use auto key, just be very aware of whether it's on or off. To enable it, just click on the auto key button here. And as soon as that's on, as I said, literally almost anything that you do is going to start creating keyframes. Not just position, rotation, but things like object parameters and materials. It's all keyable, which is amazing. But again, auto key is, kind of a dangerous tool, because if you're not paying attention, you'll start keyframing stuff without knowing it. What I want to do here is I just want to move the logo down into the frame. Now, auto key is kind of unique in that if you are not on the first frame of your timeline, then if you move something or change some parameter, 3ds Max will create a keyframe on frame 0 or whatever the first frame of your timeline is. So this is kind of a bizarre behavior, but you'll get used to it. So by way of illustration, let's say I go to, frame 120 and I grab my logo and then I move it up out of the frame. As soon as I do that, now suddenly I don't just have a keyframe on frame 120, I also get one on frame 0. And what's going to happen here now is that the object is going to move upward in the frame. So if I rewind and play this back, you'll see it move up. Okay, so that's kind of a bit non-intuitive. The fact that if there is no keyframe before the current time, when you create your first auto key, then you will get 2 for 1. You will get 2 keyframes. One at the former position, it'll be created at the first frame, and then one at the current time position. And that'll be wherever you're currently parked. So again, that's kind of weird. What I recommend to prevent this happening is to always start at frame 0 when you're using auto key, or whatever the first frame of your animation is. I'm going to select these keys here by dragging a rectangle around them and delete them and start over. Just press the delete key on the keyboard, and that deletes those keys but not the selected object. Okay, so a better way of using auto key is to start on your first frame and then place your object wherever you want it to be on frame 0 or whatever your first frame is. In this case, just right outside of the frame there. And then click on Set Key and create your key manually. And I'm just keying position currently. Okay, so this is just a workaround for the unusual behavior of auto key. I've got one set manually, and now if I go back to auto key and then go to some later point in time, let's say frame 90, and then move the object down, that's going to be a lot more predictable behavior. All right, so now I've got a keyframe at frame 90, and I had an existing one over here already. And rewind that, and now that's doing what I want. It's moving down instead of up. Cool. So that's pretty straightforward. In auto key mode, if you simply position at a particular key, like directly on a key, and then make a change, you will edit that keyframe. By way of example, let's say I park on frame 90 and then I move the object down here. As soon as I release the mouse, I've just updated that keyframe. I've overwritten whatever data was there. We can rewind that and prove that. It's going to slide over to the right. So that's actually a useful thing because, you can edit keyframes directly without having to go into the curve editor or anything else. To help you with that, sometimes you might want to advance directly to a keyframe. So on your transport controls here, there's a handy button here that says Key Mode Toggle. If you click on that, then these little arrows here don't move one frame forward. They move to the next keyframe of the selected object. So if I click this, it's going to snap exactly to frame 90 because that was the next keyframe. Okay, cool. So I can bring this back over. And as soon as I release the mouse, once again, that keyframe has been updated. Once I'm done, I have to always remember to exit out of Auto Key. And if you don't, once again, scary things may happen. Finally, of course, I can edit this. I can maybe move these down a bit. Maybe I'll take that down to frame 120 and maybe bring this one to frame 60 or something. And just like I did before, I want no ease out of the starting position, so that we have a linear rate of motion at the beginning of the animation. So once again, I'll go into the curve editor. Another way to get there is through the graph editor's menu, and I can choose Track View Curve Editor. And here we see the position keys for the logo, and I can just select those first 3 keys and set them to linear. Close that window. Rewind, see what that looks like in the camera view. So at frame 60, that comes into frame. All right, very cool. So that is Auto Key. When animating in 3D, you'll usually want to build up the animation in passes or layers. And that's simply when you animate one parameter or transform and get it mostly the way you want before moving on to the next thing, instead of trying to do it all at once. So that's what I'm doing here with the sword hilt. I've animated the position, and now I'm ready to move on to the rotations. To minimize the amount of grief that we have with rotations, we should always check in on what the optimal rotate order should be for that particular animated object. In this case, I've experimented a little already, and I determined the optimal axis order is going to be YZX. Let's go and change that. I'll select the hilt, go to the motion panel, and the rotation section here, and set the axis order to YZX. And now we're ready to go ahead and create some keyframes. Choose the rotate tool, and we want to be in gimbal as our reference coordinate system. And we've got the key filter set to position. We'll need to go into there and change that up. Click on key filters, turn position off and rotation on, then close the set key filters dialog and enable set key mode. And let's go down to the end of the animation, frame 90. I can just skip there. And I just want to rotate in the x-axis, so I can right-click in the camera view, so I don't lose my selection, and then rotate in x until that's 90 degrees or so. And if I can't get it exactly 90 degrees, I'll just type it in. 90 degrees. Okay, with that set the way I want it on frame 90, and in set key mode, I'll click on the set keys button. And now I've created a keyframe for the rotations. And if I move the time slider over and unselect that keyframe, you will see it's got 2 colors. It's both red and green. That means there's both a position and a rotation key present on frame 90. Red is for position, and green is for rotation. So you see we don't have a rotate key on frame 0 yet. Okay, cool. So I'll go down to frame 0, and with the rotate tool, I'm going to spin this around in the z-axis. I'll do that in the perspective view. Right-click to select the perspective view without losing the selection. And I'm going to rotate this around. And I want it to be about maybe 140 degrees or so. Now you'll notice that as you rotate, you're getting kind of strange numbers showing up here. So this is a little bit problematic because I can't really tell what I'm doing very well. There is a button down here that you can switch that really should affect that. But it's also kind of problematic because when you release the mouse, it will go back to 0. So the only way you will ever be able to see the rotations at all times while you're rotating and when you've released is to open up the dialog here. Right-click on the rotate tool. And we're in gimbal mode, And now as I rotate this, I can see the actual values at all times, whether I'm making an adjustment or not. So this is really the only way to do this, unfortunately. So I'm going to set that to be about 140 or so, as shown here. And I also want to rotate it in Y, just to have it pointed towards the camera a little bit. So I can rotate that and give that a value of about, let's say, -20 or something like that. All right, and with those values set on frame 0, I can click on Set Keys, and I've created keyframes there. And let's play it, see what that looks like. Okay, so that looks pretty smooth. We can make some adjustments to it. One of the 12 principles of animation from the old Disney studio is overlapping action. And that basically states that things like rotations and positions don't generally all happen at the same time. They start and stop at different times. So you want some overlap. We can adjust that in the function curve editor. I'm going to close that dialog with that hilt still selected. Go back into the curve editor. And I only care about the rotation keys here. And I don't think I've animated X, right? If I select that, it's flat, so X doesn't matter. Y and Z are all that matter, so I can control click on both of those so I can see them both at once. And I can introduce some overlapping actions so they don't actually start and stop at the same time. I don't want to actually change the values, I just want to move the positions of these keys. So I can select that key, hold down Control, and move it. So I'm changing its time, but not its value. Same thing here, I can click on one of these and drag to move it. Likewise here, hold down Control so that they're not exactly synchronized. All right, let's see what that looks like. Rewind, play it back. So I wasn't entirely happy with that. I think at the end here, I do want them to be a little bit more synchronized than they are. So I can just set them both to have the same value if I want them to sort of stop on a dime. So I can select them both and set them to end on a particular frame. So I can say, let's end them both on frame 90. Press Enter. All right, so that's our rotation keys. We can turn Set Key off again. Play that back. That was pretty straightforward. That's just the simple concept of animating in passes. Don't try to animate everything all at once. Break it up into separate little jobs and do them sequentially. There's one more essential dialog box that you need to know about to animate in 3ds Max, or indeed in almost any 3D program. And it's called the dope sheet. This is a term from traditional animation, also known as an exposure sheet. And it's a spreadsheet, it's a grid of data in which every single frame is accounted for, and information about what's happening on that frame is recorded. For example, if there's a cut on a certain point in time, or if there's some sort of action, like a character lands on the ground in a certain frame, or if you have lip sync, if you're synchronizing to dialogue, then all the words and letters are going to be written out frame by frame on the dope sheet or exposure sheet. In a 3D program, the dope sheet is simply just a spreadsheet of all of the animated tracks against every single frame. However, we don't see the actual curves like we do in the curve editor. The dope sheet is a way for you to basically move keyframes around in blocks and maybe change their global timing and so on without getting into the nitty-gritty details of the exact shape of those curves and how the animation is interpolating. Let's look at the dope sheet. It's going to be found under Graph Editors, Track View, Dope Sheet. Now by default, it's only going to show you the keyframes for the selected objects, and I don't have anything selected now. So if I, for example, select the sword hilt in my viewport, now I can see a whole bunch of keyframe data here. The way I prefer to work in the dope sheet is to have all of the animated channels or animated tracks visible, regardless of what I have selected. I'm going to deselect that hilt so nothing is selected. And I'm just going to change the option. That's going to be the filters. It's going to be found under View, Filters. And I'm going to say up here, show only animated tracks and don't show only selected objects. Under these conditions, all of the animated tracks will be displayed regardless of what's selected in the viewport. And click OK. And now we can see all the keyframes in our entire world at a glance. This is a good option in this case because I have so few keyframes. If you had, hundreds of thousands of keyframes or something, then this would be, pretty overwhelming. And you would want the default behavior where only the selected object's keys are displayed. Okay, so you can see here sword hilt has got a hierarchy, position and rotation keys. Also logo, if we open that up and open up transform, position, you'll see their keyframes for position there on the logo as well. Now, I want to just point out that you will see some keyframe boxes or ticks here in these rows that are not actually real tracks. This is kind of a little bit misleading. You'll notice that some of these rows are in a lighter color gray and some are in a darker color gray. The ones that are in light gray are actually animated tracks or channels. The rows that are displayed in dark gray are not actually tracks at all. What they are categories of tracks. So if we follow this one back, this is position for the logo. If I click on this little box, then I'm selecting all of the position keys for the logo object. If I go down here to the sword hilt, you'll see position and rotation because there are rotation keys on the sword hilt. So if I click on a box here, I will select all of the rotation keys for the sword hilt. Or if I click over here, again, I'm selecting all of the rotation keys and none of the position keys. However, this is additionally kind of misleading because it doesn't just highlight all of the things in that category. You'll also see highlighting up here. So this is, again, really misleading. It gives me the impression that all of the transform keys at that particular keyframe or position are actually selected, but they're not. The position keys are not selected. Only the rotation keys are selected. These markers here are actually unironically known in the documentation as fake keys. And I didn't make that up. They're actually called fake keys because they're not actually keyframes. They're just methods for you to select keyframes and to see what is selected. But as I said, it's a bit kind of non-intuitive. If I select just one rotation key down here, then all of the fake keys that enclose that keyframe are going to be highlighted. So it's a rotation key, so rotation lights up. And it's a transform key, so transform lights up. And it's a key on the sword hilt, so sword hilt lights up as well. So you can't really always trust this to know what's really selected. All you really know is that some keyframe within sword hilt is selected and some keyframe within transform is selected. Okay, but in any event, these can be handy because you can just drag stuff around really quickly. So for example, if I want the logo to land at about the same time as the sword hilt, I can click up here and that will select all of the logo keys. Currently, the Move Keys tool is active and I can just drag those over and position those on frame 90. I could also type it in down here. I've got a field where I can type in the frame number. All right, so let's see what that looks like. If I minimize this, play it back. There we go. So now everything is landing at the same time, pretty gracefully. There's one last helpful thing I want to mention about the dope sheet, which is there is a way that you can visualize and select all of the keys in your entire world at once. And that's done by going up to the toolbar here and clicking this button that's labeled Modify Child Keys. And if that's enabled and you're able to see the world track up here, then you can click on all of the keyframes at a certain point in time. So I could click here and select all of those keys at frame 90 and maybe move them down a few frames. Additionally, there's a ranges mode. So far I've just been working in edit keys mode, but there's also edit ranges mode. So if I click on that, now we will see bars indicating the animated ranges or the areas of the timeline that are animated. And using this edit ranges mode and the world track and with modify child keys on, I can stretch time for my entire scene at once. So if I needed to speed everything up or slow everything down, what I would do is I would click here and drag to the right to slow it down, drag to the left to speed it up. And let's see what that looks like. So now I've just basically doubled the speed of my animation. That is a really helpful thing to know about. Additionally, by the way, snapping is turned on by default. So when you do this, all of the keyframes within these ranges will automatically snap to whole numbers. If that were off, then some of those keys would land on fractions between frames, and you don't want that. All right, well, in fact, I'm going to move that back where it was to about frame 90 or so, because I think that looked pretty good. All right, so that's the dope sheet, a very useful window that you want to explore. And that finishes up our chapter on the basics of keyframe animation.